Boom! What's up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. I'm your host, Alan Sakyan. Very excited to be talking about data isn't data. Data is trust. We're going to be talking about fintech. We'll be talking about modeling, analysis. Very excited to have Damien Weldon joining us on the show. Hello.
Alan, thank you so much for the kind invitation. Great to be here.
Very excited. Very grateful for Rachel Haywire for introducing us. And I love your background. This is going to be very exciting. Damien's got 20 years in experience in data science, in product management, business development, financial services, and real estate. He's currently the founder of the Molybdenum, which is an innovation practice centered on data, analytics, and risk management, where he is a strategic advisor to several fintechs. So let's start things off with this big history take on civilization. We find ourselves as stewards of Earth. What's your current take on the human experiment?
Well, Alan, I think we've got some work to do, right? And I guess that work and that set of tasks and activities is very much centered within ourselves as people and our own personal journey and our own personal experience, but also enveloped out to the communities, and whether they're families, societies, organizations, businesses, whatever collectives we ascribe to and we believe we are members of. So I think the journey in humanity always has to start in both places. And the success of humanity, I feel, very much is around the convergence of those two journeys. So that almost an equilibrium, in a sense, between one's personal resonance, happiness, acceptance, position in the world, and those around you, or those, whether they're concentric circles in that linear model or fractals or whatever the geometry of community is these days or any day. That sense of equilibrium, quiescence, if you like, is, I think, where we should be heading. Whether we are heading there is of course the issue and the problematics.
I really enjoy how you make it this. It's the Nash equilibrium. You know, the balance between the individual self-actualization and the collective self-actualization.
Yeah, I think so, and I think if we've learned anything at all from the last 5, 10, 15 years, networkization. There's too many izations. I'll probably add to them during this conversation, but someone's got to come up with a few a more economic set of syllables, right? Because economics is about reductionism in part, and there's another set of syllables. But the idea of collectives, networks, communities, where are we in relation to the others, which classically was about just me and you, right? And what was outside. So now we think of this wider communitarian space, and that's really, really a good and positive thing. But of course, networks bring complexity. They don't necessarily bring simplicity, right? So that's where I think things just get more complicated and more multi-layered, and that's the challenge I think we find in many, many areas of our engagement with the world and indeed ourselves and humanity more generally.
Yeah. And then it was also cool how you were in attendance at the TEDx San Francisco
Right, where
talk.
I saw you speak for the first time there last fall, indeed.
And that was on the Art of Powerful Questions, and
yes.
You also are really fascinated with questions, and you like powerful questions, and you sent me this really good philosophy quote. So tell us about why you're also very fascinated with the power of the question rather than answers to things.
I think questions are generative. So they're almost like auto-generative engines. They expand, they take us forward, they take us to another place. And in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jacob Needleman, for example, and the meaning of earth and the philosophy of money and so on. Mm-hmm. But he is very, very centered on this point of how the idea of the question, the kind of philosophy of the question was actually a major driver of civilization. And of course, Google's whole business was premised on search, AKA questions, right?
You're querying the collective knowledge.
You're querying the collective knowledge. And that's where, again, to come back to the point of convergence, where data and analytics meet question and questioning.
Yeah.
Because a database query is precisely that, a question. Right, yeah. But obviously in a vocabulary of data, information, and code, right? So what we've been working with, I feel, over the last 10, 15, 20 years is where technology now becomes the questioning engine, right? And we effectively trade some of our own autonomy, perhaps, to get a better questioning engine. Because as human beings, in our evolution, it has largely been about questioning and that being the impetus to drive us forward. So now we have a set of tools in technology and data and databases and so on, together with all the constraints and limitations and enablers and all the things that you and I and many people know so well. But that's really what it's about.
Talking about it from this big history perspective, we have this collective body of knowledge that we've accumulated over time, and it's grown. The edge of knowledge has continued to go outward and outward over time. And now we're talking about one's ability to query it, which is kind of what was the cool thing about Google and Baidu and stuff, is just you can query that collective body of knowledge, and then that way you can more easily get your question answered about what you want to learn about. And again, so when someone potentially asks you about like what's the role of like a kidney in the human body or whatever, that you can now more easily, more quickly have the answer to the question. But even then, versus if somebody just says that, oh, the kidney does this, and that might only be 10 or 30% of the total answer, right? So you can keep going in depth and even more depth. And let's start talking about this in the data perspective, because there's a couple interesting ways to take this on. With, let's say, you can apply like something like a Pareto distribution to the answer of like what a kidney does in the human body, and you might want to find only the 20% of the answer that gives you 80% of the knowledge about the kidney.
Right, and that's very, very important in the business world, for example, that there's an optimization driver, an efficiency driver, productivity driver to actually find out where that 20% or that, that X% is, so that you're not wasting your time in this sort of random or semi-random spread with things that either don't make you money or don't drive you forward or don't satisfy your customer, whatever space it is that you're trying to address. But I think just again from a business standpoint, that equation of a business question, who should I market to, what are my products, all of the things that an enterprise has to wrestle, high, medium, and low, has to wrestle with day after day, that can be expressed in a query, that a query is the business question, and therefore the answer to that question, or the set of answers to that question, are basically what a data repository or a database repository is. Now, of course, that immediately then brings up the whole point, as you have in any kind of search paradigm, is how far do you go in the search? Who controls the search? Obviously now we have paid search, right? So search can be adjusted with other objectives, right? So the
that's a huge question. Who controls the search?
Who controls the search? And I worked in market research for many years in the UK, and we any market researcher will make that distinction between the open-ended question, and the closed question. The closed question is a set of codes, what's your scale of 1 to 10, or what's your highest preference? Or the open question is, what do you like about a car? So questions come with a whole apparatus around governance, around transparency. So yes, they drive us forward, but they remind me a little bit. I think it was Howard Evans, who was the editor of the London Times for many years, and it was very, very focused on photojournalism, for example. And I remember a line he wrote in a book or interview or something like that, where he said, the camera doesn't lie, but it can be an accessory to untruth. And I think of questions like that. A question of itself doesn't have a truth value in the philosophical or the logical sense, but the way the question is posed, and hence the way a query is written, and the interpretation of that, can be an accessory to unintended consequences, shall we say.
We have to be very honest with how not everything carries the same value. That's this thing. You can tag value to certain data.
Right.
That maybe this understanding of big history is a very valuable data for every child that's born into the world. But to know one person that did one thing on a farm 1,000 years ago or a couple hundred years ago might not be, like, knowing their name and what they did might not be as important as knowing this understanding of big history, right? So there's all these kind of values that we need to ascribe to data.
We sure do. I think it was Wyndham Lewis who said that human life of itself is not important. Our values make it so. And consequently, the ascription of value to a question and to a response to a question, or search and responses to question, is very, very important. And indeed, there's a whole branch of philosophy, axiology, that is devoted to that. And of course, economics, for example, as the mathematicization of value and asset and all of the commensurate pieces of that is critical to the way our society and our world is organized, and is driven forward or backward, depending on the set of constraints applicable at that time. So in terms of understanding what is value and the very close link to that between value, or the link between value and values, is critical, I think, for human understanding, and in particular for pedagogy. And you mentioned children and young children, and there's a globe behind me here, which how many young children or young adults even touch that or get a little version of that as people of my generation did as kids. So
and what's the sense of unity that brings?
And I think you mentioned a little bit at the start about data being trust, and that relationship between data and trust and values is critical. And in fact, I would submit that even within any relationship of any sort, it's the values that are the glue and the set of unifiers between two people, between a person and their community, between two entities are. What are the shared values? How are those shared values articulated? How do they grow? How do they come into equilibrium with each other? That's to come back to a point I made earlier, that's acceptance, that's quiescence, that's maybe happiness.
Yeah, that's so well said. That question about core values for both an individual, for a community, for a family, for a nation, for the globe. What are the core values? And we see that very much so as an individual, taking one's core values and actualizing them into the world. We see one's on a planetary level, the importance of having this big history perspective be one of those central core values, so that we actually realize how we are all in this union with evolution and with each other on this one rock orbiting the star. And then you started hinting at governance and law, and who owns these substrates that we query for data. Who owns the substrates that we go into virtually, into the virtual realities and worlds? Who owns the general intelligences that are of the future? Because those become then the most powerful.
Right, and if we go back to the 18th century and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the contrat social, the idea of a contract, which of course is a kernel of law, is about two parties coming together and agreeing a set of principles, constructs, and then agreeing to behave or build something together in that way. So, we have a social contract, which may be fraying at the edges at points, but what is our data contract? What is our data contract? And in order to enter into a contract, it fundamentally is the formalization of trust, or the articulation of trust in written form, and that's also applicable even in blockchain, for example. The idea of smart contracts, they are still contracts, right? They are codifications of agreement, and hence codifications of sharings, and hence codification of values. So when you peel the onion layer, or the Russian dolls, or however you want to get into the from the mantle of the earth to the core, that's really what it is. So I think so this is just critically important, I think, to where we're going and how we get there.
It's great how one can then have an understanding of values, shared values. Value is then could be seen as a data that, let's say that you and I both have the data piece of, like, of not wanting to bop each other over the head or whatever, again,
Right.
yeah, etc. And then that becomes a shared value, and then that becomes like a social contract, or potentially like just another trust contract that we have with each other.
Right, and this is where I think mathematics, numerics, data. Of course, not all data is quantitative. There's obviously.
What are the examples of data that's not quantitative?
Unstructured data, text, language, visuals, that may be through a reductionist set of techniques or indeed methodologies can be reduced to numerics. But the classic paradigm is both qualitative and quantitative data, structured and unstructured data.
Yeah.
But even if we,
and a vast majority of data today
is unstructured. Is unstructured, right?
And that includes all of the text that we put onto the internet.
Absolutely.
And this conversation is like
very much so, and visuals and pictures, and of course that in terms of data explosion over the last 5-10 years, it's primarily been through pictures and videos and unstructured qualitative type information. But just to come back to the quantitative for a moment, which is where my training and background is, when you really, even to drill into the concept of number itself, which of course is at the kernel of mathematics. We were talking earlier a little about shared value and how important that is for any kind of relationship, or contractual or agreeableness. Number itself is both singular and plural, in the sense when we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that has a uniqueness as a number, but it also applies to a plurality of objects, So in fact, even when you go back to the 19th century, when logicians started to look at number and then later Bertrand Russell and folks in the early 20th century, that idea of number being almost being like a little bit like a hologram, that you think of the idea of a hologram, which is both in itself and for itself, that the entire universe is contained in that hologram, but yet it itself is a point in the universe. And I've always been very, very fascinated about that relationship between the singular and the plural, the individual and society, the data point and its environment. That whole
these models
that are not binary, but and which again which are continuous, which are spectrum or spectrumized, but are very complicated, and in itself to even think of them as most of the way we do our analysis, of course, is to reduce dimensionality and simplify things so that we have, indeed there's a principle in analytics and machine learning that we call parsimony, which is kind of a fancy way of saying meanness, right? That we want to build the most sophisticated models, but use the least amount of data, or the least amount of attributes, or the least amount of primitive elements to understand, right? And there's some very, very good reasons for that, because they're more intelligible, they have higher explanatory power.
So there is a benefit of taking the most relatable and most structured and kind of reductionist ways of seeing things, and that's kind of like a compression of the most valuable aspects, and then teaching that there's a high value in that. But then if one does want to go deeper, then they can see it on the
and I think you use an interesting word there, Alan, compression, because when you compress a file, it's for storage reasons or for cost reasons, because you don't have the space, or you want to limit your computational overhead for calculation or a piece of analytics. But of course, what's really important is that when you compress, you don't lose something, right?
Yeah.
And that it sort of equates to, when you have an eye test, if you do your annual eye test, or the eye test we're all supposed to do each year, and you sit down on the chair, and they have this machine against your forehead, or this apparatus against your forehead and your cheeks and so on, and then the ophthalmologist puts in all these different lenses, and is that better, is that weaker, and so on. And then sooner or later you get a set of lenses, you say, okay, bingo, I'm done here. So what I think what an analyst does, and which I would advocate we should all do and do more of, is know your lenses. You know, what are you actually seeing through? And that it's your hands that are on those lenses and putting them in and putting them out and, you know, doing the adjustments and so on. Because that's that's how we should see.
This is so good.
That we have our own autonomy. And then again, in agreement, we may care rather to trade some of that autonomy for other types of utility or value.
Yes.
But that it starts with us.
Yes, this is such a good analogy, because when you take these changes in lenses at like an eye doctor, that one can also see. I've for now several years had this illustration that I've been aiming to get more and more into the mimetic sphere. Just that when you have a complicated issue like immigration or healthcare or whatever it is, at the center, that's just the one issue that you're taking into account. But then you have all of the complex, like you have what a 20-year-old thinks, what a 60-year-old thinks about healthcare. Then you have what an Indian person feels, what a person from France feels, what a person from China feels, etc. about the issue. And then low socioeconomic status, high socioeconomic status, medium. And so what you're doing is you're changing your lenses. You're viewing healthcare from the perspective of low SES, high SES, China, etc. Right. And if you can do that really well, that's when you can get behind other people's eyes. That's when you can understand the nuance of these complicated issues and how to best.
Right, and you know, in that sort of spectrum of diversification, which societally is around diversity, which is obviously critical, but you know, one of the challenges with that is that not all those lenses are equal, right?
That's the next key point. And
there's the idea of that gatekeeper lens that, you know, maybe that's in the front position, maybe that's in the back position, or wherever it is in that lens stack, you know, that has more weight. There's a gradient effectively between that, you know, uber lens or super lens compared to those others. And then that's where the issue of governance and control and consent and, you know, the data contract that I've been talking about.
Let me see if I can tackle an interesting aspect of the lenses not all being equal value. How about if you have proven, let's say, that you have a very strong abstract perspective on civilization's evolution and what the future of healthcare is in terms of preventative medicine and precision medicine and maintaining the body in homeostatic capacity of like a 25-year-old through your whole life, whatever, right? That if you can think about what I just said, right, that's a pretty good compression of what an ideal perspective on healthcare is, right?
Right.
So now the question is, how many of those then nodes looking at the central node of healthcare see it like that?
Right.
And so then that's then the question of how much of a strong, futuristic, but also taking in the history in the present of a perspective one has on the issue. And then one can also put that weighted value of that perspective is actually, that lens is actually stronger, and we need to guide more children towards that lens.
Well, there's a beautiful line in Bertolt Brecht's play Galileo, where Galileo invites some of the either the Florentine or the Milan nobility and the cardinals and bishops and so on to look through his telescope, right? And he says something, I'm going to paraphrase it here, but just look, because if you look, you'll see what I see. Yeah. And they don't look. And of course that ultimately leads him to the Inquisition and everything that eventuated from that process. So, you know, part, I think, of the data contract is, and indeed part of any contract or shared values, is seeing it as the other person sees it.
Yes.
Right? You know, putting yourself into someone else's shoes, right? And for me, there's no loss of authenticity or autonomy in that. Indeed, it's part of questioning, right? Because, you know, I would submit that your questioning actually gets an accelerant, or benefits from, utilizes an accelerant and hence obtains acceleration by precisely doing that, because your question maybe it's just is an excerpt, whereas when you have that question from the other's perspective, then it becomes a full question.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the learning through data and the learning through shared values in this data contract idea, is so important and so critical.
We spent so much time talking about lenses, and this is like kind of models as well. These are those models.
Right, because models are lenses. They are ways of both representing the world and ways of looking at the world or looking into the world.
Yeah, I can already tell that I really love the way that you see things, this mental lattice that you carry, because we have that similar perspective, and on the data side as well as on the truth side, on what's true and how to compress truth into the most relatable ways for potentially even for the seeds of children that are coming into the world.
Right.
Now, take us down Damien's journey. So the personal, the professional journey of this fascination with data, with finance, with models, with analysis, with real estate finance, etc. Take us here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So certainly, as a student at school and back in Ireland, science and in particular physics was my first love. And although I love chemistry too, and in fact, I think many chemists say that chemistry is a scientist's science, that there's something about the purity of the scientific method in chemistry that isn't necessarily the case in other areas. But leaving that aside for a second, physics was kind of where it was at for me. And of course, math and applied math in particular is kind of the language of that. And I very much thought at that time, in undergrad, that my career, my life would be centered in a school, a college, university as a, researcher or professor in physics in whatever branch, and off to the races with that. But people make a difference, and I had a wonderful math teacher and Professor Brendan Goldsmith, who really instilled in me a love of mathematics for its own sake. Right, and he was very instrumental in me moving to that route, but still with very applied roots. So not pure mathematics, but applied mathematics to use that classical distinction. So in grad school, it was numerical analysis and the idea of approximation methods that I spent a lot of time on. And it's interesting. We were talking about the binary versus the on-off versus multivariate versus continuity and so on. And it was something. In my graduate work that was really at the core of what I was doing, computing-wise, algorithm-wise, and so on, the idea of what is an approximation, right, which in turn is a representation or a representation of a representation. And the particular area of math that I was focused on, finite different methods, a branch of numerical analysis, is saying, here's a curve, here's some mathematical representation. There's no breaks, there's no on-offs there. It's a continuous function, as we say in math. But now, when we want to approximate that, we effectively sample it at different points, right? Yeah. And then build an approximation model. And that's a model that we can code and run in a computer and so on and get an answer. And then, of course, we map the actual, which is pure and continuous, to the projected, which of course is discrete. So that idea of what we called then, and I believe it's still called, discretization, right? So moving from spectrum and continuum effectively to a set of nodes or points is something that I still carry with me to this day. Yes. And I think is really at the heart of any analytics, because when you're tackling, as I am for clients, a business problem, that data is not a complete description of their world, their market, their customers, their opportunity. It's a subset, or it's an approximation, it's a representation. So how do we go from that discretization and its engine and its apparatus to truth, which is really the entire world? Yeah. So I think I've always been very, very fascinated and involved and configured around, trying to come up with that answer. And again, it sort of maps on to some of the things we've been talking about in this conversation, the individual and society, the this and the that, and really, I suppose, at a more abstract level, the relationship between the part and the whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the singular and the plural. So that's kind of like.
Can I see if I can? Let me see if I can break this again on summarize. If I can paraphrase, then it means I can. That means I'm learning at least a little bit in the kindergarten. Okay, so in a business sense as well, we can see things like that spectrum. So the non-binary, the spectrum perspective, the continuum. And then for the business, they're trying to potentially tackle something like, if we make this advancement in research and development, will people in the markets actually desire to use this advancement? And then the question then becomes, we need to take, like you said, go from this 7.8 billion potential people using this thing to let's find the nodes, these smaller individuals as well as communities of people in different places, and see, will they actually take this on? Will they actually use this research and development that we're making?
Yeah, I mean that's one paradigm, in the business space for that. But also, again, more generically, forecasting. What is the future? I mean, forecasting, is the mathematics of the future. Not in the sense that it's where math will be in the future, but it's the apparatus. It's the application of math to the future, So any form of projection, any form of, the sun will come out tomorrow. Okay, so
we were talking about
what are the grounds for that, and then what's the analytic apparatus that gives us confidence
so you're applying,
in making that point.
You're applying the math to the future in the sense of, if you have a potential of Damien's life and you see Damien stayed in Ireland, versus came to Silicon Valley and maybe started surrounding himself with really high power, high influence in people and companies out here, that maybe the trajectory in terms of overall influence would have potentially been slightly angled lower over time than higher. So people make these decisions all the time with even the food they put in their body. Am I going to eat a bunch of refined sugar right now? My health's going to go do. Versus if I eat the salad, then it's going to project upward mathematically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point that's made in the philosophy of science that facts are theory laden. There's no such thing as an untheorized fact. The very articulation of fact, the very collection of data, implicit in that is a theory, right? And consequently a view about how that will behave going forward. The present, this moment is future laden, right? It may or may not be future oriented. And again, in the analytics of this, I mean, you even go back to 16th, 17th century, and what Newton and Leibniz and all of those folks were wrestling with at the time, and that whole idea of the Leibnizian monad, which had past, present, future. I'm probably doing a little bit of a disservice, all in the one ball, to give it a geometric picture. So I think that's where that point of decisioning and also the risk of making a decision based on a model comes in, right? Because a model based on data is a representation of reality. You project and take a set of decisions or go forward based on that. But, again, in classical statistics or classical math on that, there is an error term. That model can be wrong. And the goal of working with data and analytics is as much, I would submit, to understand that error and where that error is most prevalent in the representation or the sub-representation of the space that you're bringing your math kit to. And any analyst who doesn't do that is sort of doing a disservice to themselves and to the people they're working with. Understanding the errors are as important as understanding the signals. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and if we even look back at the last financial crisis, which we spent a lot of work in the real estate and financial markets at the time, what was not foreseen. And part of the challenge there, and there's a wonderful book by Emmanuel Derman about this, Models Behaving Badly, which is that, the assumptions that are implicit, this is probably too long a set of words, but the unarticulated implicit assumptions in financial models or models more generally. So how do we, add all those extra terms in our formula, in our equations, in our algorithms that may not capture precisely what we're leaving out, but at least raise the flag, and make it explicit. And I think, again, coming back to that point of the data contract, it's in fact in a lot of contracts, good lawyers will write their contracts in such a way that they do point to what's not in the contract. And I pick up my cup of tea here, and I see on the back of my little yogi card, "You are unlimited." Yeah. And whether one is limited or unlimited, I'll leave that to others to judge and assess. But being conscious of constraints and limits, where something ends and where something begins,
yes,
that I believe is what saves us, or what helps us avoid the banana skins and the crises and the disjunctions and the dystopias that come about and are responsible for human misery and abject misery in people and society and communities.
Yeah, that's interesting, that the interconnectedness of everything, this Gaia hypothesis, that notion and understanding of reality is crucial for our footing in unity. Simultaneously, where something starts and where something ends is simultaneously extremely crucial for our footing. And then I found what you were saying for what we just said right there related to the edge of knowledge is very important, because we see so many things that are being published scientifically that are not replicable.
Right,
and this is a major issue at the edge of knowledge. So it's almost as though the more that we focus on how we can understand that limiting edge of knowledge, of civilization's collective knowledge, and how to best replicate and push at that edge and understand where certain scientific advancements start, where they end, how we can maybe translate to something else. But that edge, the way we play at the edge, is so important for our long term. And you started hinting at also the real estate. You were teaching me about this as well. There's so many variables that actually go into this that actually I think you were the first person that taught me about obsolescence in real estate. I hadn't used that word. We usually use that word with the technologies. But it's interesting to think about a home, like the homes in Detroit, for example. Some of them just haven't had tenants for over a decade or whatnot, and the interiors are in some ways, collapsing and stuff.
Right.
And then you see some of these new homes be built, and some of these new homes are already equipped with this, okay, Google, what's the population of Earth?
Right.
The population of Earth was 7.53 billion in 2017.
And now it's like 7.8 almost, and more than that. So the point is that now we have this super cool way to embed newest technologies and 2020-esque technologies into our homes that make them. So then there's that, then there's the supply and demand of the properties in the cities that they're located in, the demand of people wanting to move there. There's all these things that you had to crunch. And this was, with CoreLogic, you were 13 years of
yeah, we spent a lot of time on that. And just to untread a little bit some of what you said there, I think, again, I mentioned around this sort of paradigm that's guided and I've wrestled with in terms of singular, plural, and so on. And a lot of it, as you were talking there, I just those words of unity and diversity came back to me, right? And both as how, as a set of stressors in our lives, in our communities, in our societies, of what is the relationship between unity and diversity? How they coexist, how they intimate with each other, how they relate to each other, how the fact that you do have to have both for stability and growth and advancement. Yes. And this is where, in the wider social context, the issue of identity, of course, is so manifest currently now. And again, and the whole set of intersectionalities and the gradients within those intersectionalities can come about. So it's really, really critical. Jumping to the more the real estate and property and that side of things, I think, we live in a city here, San Francisco, the Greater Bay Area, which has been the subject of massive change over the last 5 years, and many communities and societies are experiencing this right across the world, particularly in urban areas.
Yes.
And I was just, reflecting the other day. There's a new building going up. I passed by and I remember the building that was there before.
Yeah.
Right. And and again, when we go back to our home city or home street or hometown, is it still the same, and so on? And of course, it may not be. So the question is, what are we getting, right? And where is our voice in what we get and how we get it? And in urban environments, and this is where I think politics and government and how a city is run and the voices that are at the table in making that possible are so important, because where we can all sit back and try and say, where is it going? We don't know, but where are our voices
in the decisions,
in where it's going in the decisioning, and in particular that yes, as a social good, housing, real estate. For example, in my own country, in Ireland at the moment, there's a debate going on around, potentially there being a fundamental right to housing and incorporating that into the Constitution, that there is a right to shelter.
Yes.
And again, I think, we'll all recall Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and shelter is right at the core there, yeah. That we have a need, but do we have a right to be sheltered? And then consequently that is a social good that the state and government and society needs to make available to every member of the community. But then in terms of enabling that in a built environment, and where the technology piece to your example there is that the built environments that we are creating are going to be clearly more technologized than they've ever been, and part of the fabric of that built environment is a set of networks and capabilities to do things within a room, to do things within a home that were never ever present before. And that's both the connector to other homes and our society more largely, but it's also, we have to be very, very careful, I think, sometimes that, that within autonomy, there is an isolating or a self-isolating effect of autonomy, right? That we want to be autonomous, but do we want to be isolated, right? And, as we move to a built environment where people may not shop anymore, they don't go to the mall, or they go to the mall less and less, and things are delivered and all of that.
Yep.
And we move more to that sort of, that kind of desert island type environment, and our connectivity.
Even though we're stacked on top of each other.
Even though we're stacked, exactly.
Islands.
Yeah, and that our connectivity and our communication is via exclusively or largely through electronic means, and through our devices and whatever else. So the channels that we're creating, the pipes that we're creating from our homes, from our lived spaces, from our shared lived spaces, and indeed the street itself, right? The concept of the street isn't just an avenue for trajectory, and the street is a shared space. Yeah. Right, and in an urban environment in particular, the governance of that shared space is something as a community that we all have to have a voice in. That it's not just a utility; it's something that we actually share with other people, and there are people who live in that space who are homeless or who are whatever they're doing, who share that space with us as we go by in our daily lives.
I mean, you pointing out the voice related to what is actually occurring with the trajectory of civilization is such an interesting question.
Who's at the table?
Yeah.
Who's at the table? And and again, being mindful of who is not at the table, right? Who wasn't invited to the table? I think in advocacy, in any form of innovation, it's very, very important. It comes back to this kind of error term I was mentioning in analytics of what's being left out, right?
Yeah.
And even if what's being left out by definition, doesn't have a voice at the table, that there's an articulation by those who do have a voice at the table to say, you know what, A isn't here, B isn't here, C isn't here, to make it manifest, you know? And that in turn is a sharing and then potentially an invitation to those who don't have a voice to come to the table and for there to be an enablement of that.
If we could reset and potentially redesign civilization from scratch, these are the questions that we like thinking about these simulations, that it could be interesting to see how, if we would slow down and think, could we actually educate all of the children to be completely well-rounded contributors to the democracy, to the democratic republic that we could potentially live in as a union on Earth?
Right.
And then the sort of weight that the data, the value of that voice becomes an educated value. There's like but then that whole notion that everything that we see is like unequal in some ways, that it's all hierarchical in biology.
Well, this
and
is
everything.
Again, I mentioned earlier Rousseau's Du Contexte Social, and the people that he taught about in framing that, he was very influenced by the watchmakers of Geneva, I think it was. That this was, this egalitarian community, and he looked at that as a model for how, communities and polities and society should be. And, in the data contract, what are our ideal communities of shared value, of shared exchange, and again, fundamental to economics and indeed to Marxism as one strand of that is the idea of exchange. And of course, any transaction by definition has a bidirectional exchange of money for goods or money for services. That's the whole basis of commerce, that it is an exchange, it is a relationship, it is a sharing, it is premised on a set of rules. And when those rules are distorted through fraud or misfeasance or distortions in a market, or unanticipated or unintended consequences, that's when we all tend to suffer and get whacked and whopped.
Yes. So the relation to data being trust, and the relation to even on like a real estate finance side of things, is that when you bake in Ireland in the clause of giving people access to homes as a human right, that the access to the home they get will not be the multi-million-dollar beachfront property which has the brand newest technology, which is also very interesting on a socioeconomic and hierarchical perspective of equality, but also difference. And so these are the pressing kind of questions that is really cool to talk to you about in an abstract way, and then also getting down to 90% of all of the data that is created in the last 2 years, and it just keeps doing that. So how do you structure this data, make it applicable to our lives, especially on a biometrics level?
Right.
Because we want to be able to get to that one really quickly, so we can live longer, be more creative, contribute more, live more with happy times with our families, and all this good stuff.
Right. Well, it's interesting to see, there's a number of movements and initiatives now around, for example, just in cognate areas like ethics in artificial intelligence, for example. How algorithms, should there be a public interest editor type individual at the social media companies, who can represent, similar to a public interest editor in a newspaper, who can represent the voice of the Facebook user or the Google searcher, in saying, these algorithms are in part a public good, right?
Like the street.
Like the street that we share, right?
The news feed is like the street. Wow.
It's like a channel, it's a flow, it's a vector, it's a trajectory, which we all share in, and this is, I think I made this point to you earlier about, the tributaries becoming the river, right? And no great river is untributarized, right? In that sense. So I think,
it requires all of us to join into the newsfeed or join into the substrate that is that we're the tributaries leading into the river.
Yeah, very, very much so. And of course, in a river, it's the climate or the geology that governs the rivulets and the swamps, or whatever way that water, the whole hydrology of that, right? It's nature, the landscape, however you wish to posit that. But people are different, right? And the society is different, because there you've got a concept of power and a concept of gradient and a concept of representation. Obviously, in a democracy where we vote and enable and permission folks to represent us, and then and that's how a society is governed and structured. So, yeah.
I love your analogy on the tributaries in the river. To me, that says a lot about how we have different amounts of water, that it's also kind of like the brightnesses of stars in our galaxy, in a sense as well, that one of us may be one of the tributaries that leads in that let's just pick like the Dalai Lama or something, right, that is trying to make this peaceful push, the unity push, and someone else may be trying to make the same peaceful unity push, but with much smaller of a megaphone for their voice. So, and then some people might be still pursuing greed and gluttony, and those might be large river or large tributaries that are pushing into the river as well. And then all these things are mixing together in this reality.
Yeah, I mean, look, people have lives and people have priorities and people need to get things done. And it's hella difficult to have a cosmic vision when you're worried about the next paycheck, right?
That's right.
And then if you have a cosmic vision, then maybe you don't need to, then maybe you're a person who never is worrying about the next paycheck, right? So I think, the sense of purpose and purposing across individuals and people and families and communities and whatever their collectives are is very, very important. I think, what we've been talking about here very much is around a shared space where voices are both heard, both invited and heard, that error terms in this data contract, as I've been articulating, are spoken, and that over time they're minimized, and that the idea of and again, just coming back to the finance piece and real estate piece for a second, again, the last financial crisis, it was again, I referenced, I'd mentioned of Emmanuel Derman's book about models behaving badly, that now every bank, for example, every large bank will have a team of people focused just on model risk, the risk in the model itself. And that's something that's regulated, that's something that DC pays attention to. So, maybe that's an appropriate paradigm to apply to social media algorithms or recommendation engines or how search is done.
Yes.
Right? That we actually have, a set of folks whose job is to identify that risk, articulate that risk, communicate that risk, and then have a set of rules and compliance or whatever it may be around how that algorithm or set of algorithms is actually deployed, And I think fundamentally that is good for any democratic society or any society that's based or that is committed to shared values.
Interesting, the risk in the model having error, in actually having that be a primary focus in algorithms. That's really cool.
Right, absolutely, and I think that was one of the the big regulatory changes post the financial crisis. I mean, there's always been some of that for sure, but it was codified in a much more systematic way. I think also, to your point about the interconnectedness within the financial system, financial markets, how that ultimately touches consumers, borrowers, and so on. It's the whole piece of whack-a-mole, right? Where you think you imagine a carpet on a floor that hasn't been laid correctly. There's a little bubble or a little hump on it, right? Now, of course, you walk on it, you can push that bubble and hump somewhere else and not see it. It could be under your chair, it could be under the couch, right? Mm-hmm. But when you take up the furniture, you realize, oh, hey, there it is, right? But you've got a finite boundary there. So I think part of analytics and investigation and indeed good governance in this data contract is very much around, well, where are those humps and bumps and moles and whatnot in the carpet? Because that may be the origin of the next crisis, aka dystopia, aka abjection in terms of what's happening to our communities and society.
Yeah, and I love it when people speak with these powerful analogies. Like, that's a new one to me too, is the humps in the carpet. Kind of, a lot of times we do just sweep things under the carpet.
Under the carpet, right? But this is where, whatever's under the carpet, that's a little bit to one side. This is the carpet itself hasn't been fitted properly, which is also an interesting analogy with a model and goodness of fit, as we call it in statistics.
Goodness of fit,
Goodness of fit, right? That the model is a good fit to the data, but not overfitted or underfitted. And that point, which model risk is largely about, and hence the fact that the model is a representation of reality, is that the model has stability. In other words, when new data is presented to it, and hence when the model is stressed, that it's still stable, that it still works, that it still performs above a given threshold. And the more and more we can include in our modeling, in our formation of algorithms, in our governance of algorithms, about what it doesn't do as much as what it does do, and that where it is weak and where it is strong, and making that manifest and communicating that, then I think we have a richer shared space for decisioning and happiness and effectiveness and productivity and all the things that we want. That's really where it all starts.
This takes us again to the applicability of this massive waterfall, this fire hydrant that's happening with the data.
Data explosion. Yeah.
Making it applicable.
Yeah.
Okay, and this seems to be a decent amount of what you're doing with the molybdenum. Teach us about this. Teach us about exactly how what we've been talking about is the essence of this, working with these massive organizations that want these key insights.
Yeah, so we say maths, finance, art, and part of happiness is putting on a screen what you like to do, I guess. So maybe that's what I'm doing here. And I think we've talked a lot about data, math, analytics, and so on. And I think for the financial system, of which real estate is an extension, and particularly the financing of real estate, which is kind of the area of professional interest that I spend most of my time on, and how it can come about that we've talked about homes, the built environment, what's happening in that space, but the financing of that is largely, if you think about credit or a loan, it is largely about actualizing now, actualizing now and owning now and having benefit from now that is out of sync with the financial assets of that person or that community, right? So by definition, you wouldn't need a loan or have a loan or any form of credit if you had those financial resources, or you may choose not to use your financial resources, but instead take credit or a loan instead, right? But obviously that loan has to be paid back over time, and that's where the whole idea of an interest rate coupon comes about in the financing. So when there's a decision that is a credit decision, you're making a projection about the future. You're making a set of hypotheses around the credit worthiness of that enterprise, of that individual, of that household, in order to make their home and where they live a reality. So I think it's a very, very data intensive, data rich area now. Because of computational power and the reduction in the economics of the cost, or the changes in the cost of computation applied to that, we now have access to, as you said, a whole set of data and data elements and data explosion that go into those decisioning and those decision engines and scoring engines and whatnot that we never ever had before. And I think again, as analysts and as data scientists, we always have to be cognizant that these are representations of reality. And so again, coming back to the point that I've mentioned several times in this conversation, there is much about what is left out as what is included. inclusion and exclusion, and being very, very manifest about that. I think where the art comes in here for me as the molybdenum is and again, it brings us right back to that analogy or set of metaphors around the lenses and in the optician or the eye test or the ophthalmologist is, and again, data visualization, information visualization has been talked about and been around for many, many years. If we even go back to a map, of course, which is the visualization of geography and real estate. I mean, that ultimately goes back to Ptolemy, 2,000 years ago, right? But cartography itself, of course, is political and is a set of choices and embeds power. And indeed, in this networkization that we've touched on several times in this conversation, there has also been, I would submit, an aestheticization as well. That there's a, which is maybe too fancy a word for things being
aesthetics,
or being beautified or being, endowed with a richer visual content.
Absolutely. Which we kind of see in all of these little sci-fi movies, these gorgeous data visualizations. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, this is not an appropriation of art or visualization, but it's actually looking at that as a tool to help our communities see better.
Yes.
Right. And in many ways, it's it goes right back to the roots of modernism, in art in the early 20th century. I think it was, Vasily Kandinsky, in his book concerning the spiritual in art, who said that the task of the artist isn't to render the visual, but to make visual, and that's a significant part of what I'm trying to wrestle with in this molybdenum sandbox. What is the way to, and I don't see that as revealing or or going up to the top of the mountain and beating the drum, but it's sort of making manifest and using a set of visual and mathematical and analytic and data languages to bring clarity. And we started, I think, a little bit early in this conversation around questioning and the generative quality of questioning and how it takes us forward, how it advances us. So I really see the mechanics and the tools of visualization and helping us be better visualizers, meaning that enables a richer way to come to the shared space, because in my Galileo Bertolt Brecht example, we're all looking through that telescope.
Yeah. Okay, so then is it fair then to say that a lot of what you are caring about with the molybdenum is helping people see through that telescope, see through to a more beautiful way of understanding data, a more knowledgeable way of understanding
it's a more knowledgeable way of understanding what they're doing in the world, and looking at data and data languages and model languages as providing richer vocabularies to describe the world.
Yes.
That a lot of it, again, it's that generative quality that that we expand our vocabularies, we expand our tools. It's our color palette. It's not just the three, it's the color wheel. It's not just the blue, red, and white, or the red, white, and green, whatever it may be. But it's that full spectrum that expands our vision and our positioning in the world, and how we relate to others, and how we provide services and goods, as enterprises or people or communities. So the beautification piece, and I don't see beauty and aesthetics as being the one thing. I think there isn't an auto overlap there. I think with beauty and the appeal and all of the kind of warm and fuzzies of that's something that still, I think, requires its own piece of work in terms of us understanding its height, width, and breadth, and the seduction of that and the constraints of that, I think, are as important as much as the appeal.
Okay, now I want to ask you about the technical side of things.
Sure.
Okay, so how does one take this fire hose of data and help people see it with a better lens?
Right, it's a big question and a great question, and indeed, in some respect, as an analyst, it's a lifetime's quest, you know, and re-hyphen quest, you know, because there's almost like an inbuilt recursion to it, and you know, again, I mentioned philosophy of science. I think Karl Popper, I think entitled his autobiography, Unended Quest. So maybe
Unended
quest,
Quest,
question,
yeah.
requested, unended quest, you know, blah, 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 blah. You know,
Yeah.
maybe they're all in the one little.
And you also point to
little
something interesting on a technical level, which is that if you look at code written 60 years ago, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, that there has been this process of needing to new coding languages coming in that
Open
make things
source.
easier, open source technologies. And so the way that things just move makes it quite difficult then to be able to make something in the digital space that can last for decades in the,
Right.
in the first
Well,
place.
this is the classic, you know, inbuilt obsolescence, right? That you know, there's this, you know, Trojan, not in the malicious code sense, but that there's something already inbuilt that is going to auto destruct or you know, auto decay, or basically make it have less utility or less value, right?
Yeah.
That you know,
That's
that
interesting.
should be good with that. We should roll with that. We should accept that.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, I think if you talk to any product manager worth his or her salt,
Change is good. Yeah.
yeah, but also, you know, let's be explicit about our sunsetting. You know, we know a day is going to turn into night. We know that, you know, a cell phone or mobile phone once we carried around with it,
briefcase,
right,
yeah.
and so on. You know, part of the you know, the real worry about utopias is that they tend to be bundled with infinity, right? And they don't last, right? They come to an end. And again, you know, in terms of questioning, and you know, I think one of the, you know, I'll come back to your core question in
Yes.
a second, but you know, confusion in part is around blurred limits, right? And blurred constraints, and not seeing or not having the tools or having the enablers to see things more sharply delineated, right? And I think part of, now I will come back to your question, part of this whole data mishima or melange or, you know, big soda bread of data is making the constituent segments and its boundaries more clear, more clear. And I think, you know, when you step out of the detail of a lot of what we've chatted about, I would, you know, the kind of leave you with one takeaway thing is that, you know, clarity is a prize, a huge prize. Clarity.
How do you draw those lines, though? How do you figure out where to say that this is out of the massive fire hose, out of the massive spectrum of data, that we're going to take this node, we're going to take these, and we're going to visualize them in this way? And how do you do that?
It has to be relative to a set of criteria, right? Which is, you know, what are the important things? What are we actually trying to get done? What are the important things that this is all about?
Can
right?
you run us through a business example?
Yeah, so you know, it is a form of assessment and judgment. You know, that and again, I mentioned this point earlier in data science, that we usually build our models from a principle of parsimony, which is, you know, the least amount of data having the maximum utility, right?
That's so great.
And also data that has the maximum explanatory power, right? And or prowess. And this is a challenge, for example, in some areas within machine learning, that, you know, these models are ultra good. You know, they're so high performing. You know, all singing, all dancing, but can they explain what's going on, right? Do we really have a sense? And I think, you know, right at the heart of science is a satisfaction that we understand, right? And there is a sort of, we get sated by that. It's after like having a good glass of wine or a nice meal. It's, you know, and when we
completing something hard
completing
on our
something,
objective.
yeah, and when we don't have that, we're a little bit disconsolate, and we want to go back and do it again, you know. And I think sometimes that is a trade-off between, you know, the performance, the predictability, the efficacy of an analytic and a model, and its intelligibility, right? Or particularly to a business person, or to a consumer, or to someone who isn't a data scientist, or, you know, or coder or programmer, who isn't going to see the innards of how something is done. And I think that's why, you know, the what I'd call the public space, or the quasi-public space, you know, of say a social media algorithm is, you know, or an algorithm that affects decisioning, is very, very important, that people have, you know, have some sense of why this decision was made, right?
Correct.
And they may not have their hands on that wheel. You know, we don't all need to, you know, be able to, we can all go on a cruise without knowing how to captain the ship, right? But we trust that captain and we trust that crew. And that's what the data contract, trusting our data, trusting the data.
That becomes how, when do you trust the black box is the question. Or like, how do we build ecosystems of human flourishing where black boxes exist that we trust?
Well, at one, so
and I want you to get into also that,
sure,
the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the black box, because it's very, very prevalent. And, you know, from one standpoint, one might say, look, you can never trust a black box. By definition, it's opaque. How can you have trust if there isn't some form of transparency? You know, on the other end of the scale or spectrum, to keep our color analogy going, we might say, well, every black box should be a white box. But maybe white boxes don't have content because they're all illumination, or you know. So maybe there's a gray box. You know, maybe there's a gray box, which you know, and gray isn't necessarily the most exciting of colors for many people.
But like you said, some people know how to captain the ship, but how do we trust that?
So that gray box, you know, which may be the sort of visual of the data contract that I've been talking about, maybe that's good enough. You know, maybe that respects the proprietary nature, or IP, or secret sauce, or trade secrets, you know, of the provider, you know, in commerce. But it gives us enough clarity, or enough deconfusion or unconfusion to be able to trust it, and to make a transaction and have exchange for goods, services, and and consequently a relationship. So
it can be tough if it becomes the monopoly where we can't actually engage with it and aim to help contribute to it. That can change things up.
That's right, and I, you know, I can respect that you have black boxes. You can respect that I have black boxes.
Yeah.
But how do we build a gray box together, right? And if we don't build a gray box together, then maybe we won't do business with each other. Maybe we won't be friends. Maybe we won't have a relationship. Maybe we won't be associates or acquaintances, whatever that is. So I think that's, you know, and you know, whether it's black, gray, or white, the key point is illumination, right?
Illumination and
shining light on something.
collaboration. Yeah.
Right, and
transparency.
It's that you know, Supreme Court Justice, I forget their name, or Appellate Court Justice, who said, you know, in reference to some famous case that was litigated before the court, that you know, is it either sunlight or sunshine is the best disinfectant?
Oh, that was a great one. Yeah,
you know the one
that
I'm
was a
talking
great
about.
one. Yeah, sunlight's the best disinfectant.
Thank you. Sunlight.
Illumination again is
it's the best disinfectant.
Yeah,
you know, that's what we need.
And illumination from inside, the sincere self-work that we all so need to slow down.
Right, and to me, you know, that's where you bring in the value of authenticity.
Yeah.
Right? That in commerce, in society, in relationship, that authenticity is generating your own light, and it's self-generated, and then it's an invitation to, hey, look at my light, share in my light, and hey, I'd like to do that with you too.
Yes.
Right, and that is the grounds, I believe, of, you know, an authentic life and an authentic enterprise and an authentic practice or professional practice or whatever one is doing in the world.
Okay, so take us through, let's get through this as quick as we can. What happens when, does usually a company have a swath of unstructured data and then they talk to you, and then what language is that data stored in?
Yeah, it's all of the above. So, in some cases, people have, a surfeit of data, both internally to their organization or enterprise, or what's coming at them through the world or through their competitors or through the regulators, whatever it may be. In some cases, they feel they don't have the right data, that there's something missing. So it's all of the above. And my task as a data scientist and an analyst in working with a team and collaborators is to, again, bring clarity to that. What is there and what is needed, and then ultimately, bringing those into a relationship with each other, that the wants and the needs are solved for through a process and through a framework that can bring them the desired outcome.
Okay, so then there's this massive swath of data. They have a desire, a need, etc. They work with you, and then what usually then is your process for having the data, for taking the data, and then through what language are you then visualizing it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a number of steps or sub-steps within that. Part of the initial approach is an inventory. What is there, so that there's actually, a single source of the encyclopedia, if you like, of the internal and external data that's going to be germane to what the problem or the business objective.
And what code is that usually written in?
It can be, again, anything under the sun. It can be, it can be in a SQL database. It could be in OR. It could be a cloud structure. It could be on-prem. Depending on the legacy data warehouses or data repositories within the organization, it could be open source. One never goes in with a cookie cutter. Let's tick these boxes. You go in with a white piece of paper, and then you listen and you understand, and then you start to formalize.
And then those legacy ones are harder to work with sometimes. And then your way of working with SQL or these different sort of data to be able to take and visualize it. Do you use Can you use a single language to take in the data and visualize it?
Again, sometimes not. Certainly. This goes back to my work in data in the 90s. We like to form what we call a single view, right? So that all of the key data elements that we need to build an analytic and hence, solve a problem or achieve a business objective, that they are in the one place. Now, they may not be physically in the one place or indeed virtually in the one place, but from a data model standpoint, we have our arms around them to use it in that way. Yeah. And an important part of that process and a further step in that process is to execute what we call a data audit, right? So that we basically sort of point our set of lenses at that data to understand, its range, to understand its quality, to understand its sourcing, to understand its bias, right? Because again, jumping way ahead to building a model or an algorithm on that data, and indeed this is very, very prominent, for example, in ethics work in AI at the moment. Bias, how do we get visibility on bias, and what's the self-bias in that? You can't understand bias in a model or an algorithm without understanding the sourcing, because who decides what the sourcing is? Who makes a choice from multiple data elements from that source to be part of the sandbox in which the algorithm is computed? Yeah. So you have to go. It's kind of like snakes and ladders. You got to make sure you go right back to the start to understand. Because to my mind, data is a memorialization of a transaction, right? Whether that's the view of a web page or the purchase of a cup or the age of a person. It's basically capturing an event, right, or point in time. So if you're ultimately building a set of analytics architecture and architectonic on that ultimately is going to drive a decision, you better well know where that data came from, and behaviorally what it actually represents. So, there is, I think you used this term yourself, Alan, in some of your work, the mathematics of sociology, right?
Yeah.
That, fine, you have a model at the end of the day and charts and graphs and all of the apparatus of that, but ultimately, particularly in any area of consumer behavior as it touches in finance or mortgages or real estate and so on, it's about people. It's about understanding what people have done and what people have a propensity to do and what people may do. And, so you need to be very, very, you need to be in a place where you can speak and articulate that through the language of models and data. And that's really, my fundamental role when I work, with teams and collaborators. It's really to, try to discern that voice, listen that voice, articulate that voice, but use a set of tools and data and analytics to give voice.
Yes, that's well synthesized. I'm so curious about all of the millions of applications of wanting to query data sets and how to visualize those and what exactly are these key insights that can be pulled from the data sets, and how do you go through the techniques of properly doing so is all very, very interesting to me.
And I just on the point, if I may, we may well move to a position in our society, in our communities of, what I would call our self-data governance, who owns our data, who controls our data. That if you think of the early economists, the physiocrats in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, fundamentally it was land that was the asset, right? Pre-industrial revolution, right? That's what governed power in society, who owned land, who had access to land, who had rights on land, who created value from land. Fast forward to now, 2019 and beyond, perhaps data is the new land.
Yeah, and
data is the new
oil,
land,
new
right?
diamonds,
and that the ground
new
that
gold.
I stand on is a physical ground. Right now, we're in your studio doing
Yes.
that, but I stand on my data.
Every moment in time, what Damien Weldon's doing is a precious point in data. How well his
not just Damien
physiology-
Weldon or Alan, but
Yes.
everybody in the world.
And everybody, exactly, yeah. So then the interesting way of potentially seeing data then is one of, I think, the most interesting ways is that then the greatest, the second greatest invention that we have is our data and that we leave behind, and the first greatest invention is how to actually measure that and make it applicable to our lives. And then the second greatest invention happens with all 7.8 billion of us every single moment to moment, but the first greatest one hasn't really been invented, and that's how to make it applicable. And then what we're seeing a lot of nowadays.
I saw a movie recently, How to Train Your Dragon. It's how to train your data. How to grow your data.
That's
how
good.
to all of that. We teach children quite properly to learn to read, to write, to do math, the curriculum, the syllabus, in all areas of education. But, I believe there will come a point, and this is my futurist projection here is at an appropriate point in pedagogy, hey, I have data, what do I do with it? How can it help me live my life? Who wants to take that from me? Who wants to buy that from me?
Let me paint the last part of that that phrase that I was just going to. The end of that thought was, and this kind of plays right into what you were just saying, is just that once we have that greatest invention about how to make that data applicable, is that then we have what we can call this. What happens after that, which is who owns that data, which is where we're both heading there. And you can see things as a valve. If you own the data, you can go and start releasing some of the valves and giving the access to certain organizations to start potentially anonymously or completely transparently, using that data to make medical advancements or other research advancements, etc.
Right.
Good stuff, good stuff. There's also the alternative method, which is in a way a little bit more kind of crazy, is that black box method, where it's just the owners of the substrate, the Google or Baidu or China or US or whoever, is the one that just controls it, period, and you get no access to like self-governance way, but you just trust that entity to do it. So that's kind of this this big picture data, what is going to happen and what are we going to pass down to kids for the next generation. And I have some questions on the way out. Do you have any wrapping thoughts prior to the
Well, I'd love to hear your questions, and maybe we'll wrap W or AP and or AP intertwined with those questions, perhaps.
Cool. All right, so let's hit the first one that I want to ask you is, are we alone in the cosmos?
Well, I'm a little bit of an antiquarian, so I've referenced folks from the 16th century, 19th century, and so on, and I'm going to be a little bit chauvinistic and reference an Irish philosopher, George Berkeley, in the 17th century, and you know, just pluck and pick out something that's a little bit of a paraphrase of what he wrote, but are we a dream in the mind of God? You know, which I think is very much linked to your simulation impulse and you know how you're situated in the world, Alan. And you know, to me, I would reframe that question. It's not so much are we alone in the world, but I'm wrestling with this a little bit, but it's more around, you know, isolation as a synonym for loneliness, right? And you know, that whether I'm good or not, with whether we're alone or whether we're not alone, I sure as hell don't want to be isolated, right? And I think you know, that connectivity that if one has and one owns and one inculcates and cultivates a sense of connection and connectivity with whatever, and hopefully something that's beneficial, that solves for that question. And as long as that is generative or auto-generative in the questioning way that we've been talking about it, that I feel pretty comfortable.
Yeah. And then that leads us to the simulation question. Are we in a simulation?
Well, if we are, I want to make sure that I have my hand on the joystick or my hands on the wheel. And again, it comes back to the point of voice and being at the table. You know, there's this interesting concept, more than interesting concept now, of the digital twin, and you know, and you know, which goes back to the whole, you know, Second Life and persona creation, and you know, Snapchat and so on. You know, these you know, Baudrillard simulacrum and all of that, and you know, that the whole idea of this simulation in some sense is a self-otherization. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like an idempotency that, you know, we go out to return to ourselves. And if that's a conscious journey and a conscious choice that we, you know, create our simulation or a part of our simulation in order to come back to our truer selves, our more authentic selves, then yeah, sign me up.
I like that. That's a meta perspective on it. I like it. Yeah. It's the growth. We're constantly going towards that growth, however, to get there. Okay. Two more. This one is, what would be a best principle or core value that you think would be very important for parents and children around the world?
Gosh, acceptance. Acceptance. To come into acceptance with yourself as a human being, and to come into acceptance with those around you. And from that point of acceptance, that's where all change and growth happens. You're laughing.
Because it feels right, you know? It feels right, it feels true, it feels we're accepting the current state of humanity and the current state of all individuals for the way it is, and then we're always doing our best to make it better for the next generation.
Yeah, it's just to be a little bit reductionist about it. It's kind of before the future, there has to be the present. The starting point is now, and the most stable starting point is acceptance and an equanimity with what is around us and what is internal to us. That point of equanimity then gives us the best chance or the best toolkit or whatever it may be to then come into a relationship.
Even keel, just so in love with the current state.
Yeah, the warm breeze.
The warm breeze. Damien, last question is, what do you think is the most beautiful thing in the world?
I think the most beautiful thing in the world is the... Can I say two?
Yeah.
I would pick love and the overcoming of loss. And that those two things are very closely related.
That's cool.
And that, that passion, which is bounded with love, and compassion, which is about the overcoming of loss and grief. To my mind, those things are really ultimately the same thing, passion and compassion.
Love and getting through the loss and overcoming loss. That's very powerful.
Because it's fundamental to all learning.
To all learning.
Right. So any heuristic is about making mistakes. Right. It's about spending time on something that wasn't productive or didn't yield something. Now that's a very kind of fancy way of saying loss.
Yeah.
Right. In a life, in a community, in a society. But there can be no learning. There can be no growth without loss. So, acceptance is also about accepting loss and also about accepting love.
Damien, I love this. This is so good. Thank you so much for teaching us about this. This has been such a pleasure.
It's been such a pleasure.
This has been such an honor having you on the show.
Thank you so much indeed, Alan. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your kindness in inviting me today. Thank you.
You are super welcome. You're super welcome back anytime. There's so much to still talk about data and understanding this. It's like a big fire hose and how to be able to make it applicable to our lives and just also on the philosophy side of things. It's been such a pleasure. Yeah, on an abstract civilizational perspective. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We greatly appreciate you. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you're thinking. Also, do support awesome artists and entrepreneurs that you believe in. Damien's links are below. Our links are below. Go check out his work. Check out our work as well. And go and build the future, everyone. Manifest your dreams into the world. We love you so much. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you soon. Peace.